The summer air in Texas could flatten a soul. By mid-morning, the light shimmered so fiercely that even the barbed wire fences looked molten, trembling in the heat. Inside one of those fences marked Camp Hearn, 1944. Stood a long wooden shack, its walls sun-bleached to the color of old bone. Through the open doorway drifts the faint scent of soap powder and rainwater, improvised shampoo swirling in a tin basin. A few German women stand at attention, not for roll call, but around a salvaged mirror. Their scissors flash like tiny blades of lightning, their hands sure and practiced. Before the war, they shaped coiffures in Bremen and Hamburg. Now, they work with dull blades and uneven combs beneath a flag not their own. A Texan ranch wife sits nervously in the chair, a camp chair stolen from the mess hall boots, dusty, hair sweat-matted from morning chores. Her husband wears the guard's uniform, posted just outside the door. Neither quite knows what to say. The prisoner clears her throat in careful English. "Shorter? Yes?" she asks. A nod. Then only the steady rhythm of steel on hair. In that rhythmic snipping, something remarkable happens. The boundaries blur. A woman once labeled enemy tends to another's comfort. A wife of the conqueror closes her eyes, letting herself be cared for. For a few minutes, war stands at the door and waits. The client exhales, a long-held breath. "Feels heavenly," she murmurs. The hairdresser smiles, a real one this time, fragile but proud. She has given something simple, yet sacred, the feeling of being presentable, human, ordinary. It's easy to imagine war as noise and fury, but there are quieter fronts too. Here, the struggle is against despair and distance, fought with a comb and a gentle touch. It asks one lingering question that will echo through every story that follows. In a world built on division, how far can kindness carry across a line of wire? By the summer of 1944, the war had stretched its shadow halfway around the world, but in the heart of Texas, daily life still followed the slow rhythm of the plains. Cotton needed picking, cattle needed herding, and the air shimmered with heat so steady it could make the horizon dance. That quiet continuity hid something extraordinary. All across Texas, over 80 sites in total military trucks carried an unexpected cargo: prisoners of war. Most were German soldiers, captured in North Africa and Europe, but among them were a few women nurses, clerks, communications aides swept into captivity by the machinery of armies. They traveled in the belly of a conflict that had erased borders, only to end up in a land with skies larger than they'd ever seen. The United States built camps that dotted the countryside from the piney woods to the desert plains. Each camp was fenced, but not brutal. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work for pay in local industries, study languages, and even organize small cultural socials. The arrangement suited everyone. Texas farmers faced wartime labor shortages, and the government found respectful employment that kept prisoners occupied and out of trouble. In those years before air conditioning and during rationing, civilians lived lean but neighborly lives. Food took imagination. Sugar and coffee were guarded treasures. Ranch wives managed households while husbands joined the army or supervised farmhands and POW labor crews. Communities rallied around church picnics, quilting bees, and blackout drills, trying to keep normal alive. Yet curiosity about these strangers behind the fence ran deep. For the German detainees, the first surprise was scale. The land rolled on without end, a geography that made them feel both tiny and strangely free. They wrote home about sunsets as wide as the ocean and about the strange music of English spoken with a Texan twang. Not all encounters were kind. Suspicion lay heavy at first. The war in Europe raged on, and every local newspaper carried headlines about Allied sacrifice. To show sympathy toward an enemy alien could invite whispers. Still, work details brought daily contact. Prisoners harvesting fruit, repairing fences, fixing machinery. Simple interactions, trades of water, tobacco, or humor began to dull the sharpness of fear. And then, within one corner of Camp Hearn, practicality and pride found common ground. Among the few captured women were trained hairdressers who noticed an obvious deficiency. Every head in camp, guard and prisoner alike, looked half feral under the Texan sun. A proposal surfaced quietly, almost sheepishly, to open a small beauty corner. It would boost morale, they reasoned, and cost nothing more than soap and water. The camp commander approved, likely imagining it as a harmless distraction. But the women saw more. Behind their makeshift salon's cracked mirror, they glimpsed a way to reclaim dignity and, perhaps, to meet the people whose language hummed just beyond the wire. That is where our story truly begins, between ration lines and red dust, where necessity met creativity, and a few pairs of borrowed scissors prepared to cut through more than hair. The morning they opened the salon, the sky was a hard, stainless blue and smelled faintly of dust and cattle. The barrack that would serve as their workspace had once been a laundry shed, narrow, window cracked, noisy in the wind. Someone had brushed the walls with pale paint, half a shade lighter than the sand, giving the illusion of cleanliness. Inside, 3 mirrors, scavenged from a dismantled officer's quarters, leaned against the wall, slightly warped. Their reflections rippled like water. Lotte Friedrich, 28, placed her scissors on a folded towel and took a breath that tasted of soap and rust. She'd trained in Bremen, where the air had once smelled of sea salt and pomade. Here, her toolkit included a dented pail, a handful of surplus combs, a cracked bottle of disinfectant, and a single precious tin of cold cream left from before her capture. It was enough to begin. When the first civilian visitors arrived, wives of the local guards and neighboring ranchers, the air thickened with curiosity. Hats came off hesitantly, words slower still. The women spoke across a language fissure, bridged only by gesture, a smile, a tug at one's own hair, the universal shrug that meant, whatever you can do to tame this mess. Lotte and 2 others, Erica and Hilda, worked in rhythm, measured and silent until laughter burst through by accident. A guard lounging in the doorway tried to translate jokes that moved faster than his vocabulary, but laughter, like music, sounded the same in any tongue. The local women were fascinated by European coiffures, the way the Germans rolled and pinned with such precision. In turn, the prisoners marveled at the Texans' sturdy practicality. No ribbons, no lacquered curls, only hair clipped short for constant wind. They traded secrets: how to set waves with tin curlers heated on a stove, how to braid hair snug enough to handle a day's work in the corral. A ritual of trust grew. Each client leaned her head forward, exposing her neck. Each stylist lifted the hair carefully away from skin still pink from the sun. In those gestures, vulnerability passed back and forth. Talking came easier. The conversations roamed. Gardening tricks for dry soil, clever substitutes for rationed sugar, the price of fabric in Brenham, the latest rumor of when the war might end. Around the mirrors, resentment diluted itself into curiosity, and curiosity into cautious friendship. Sometimes the salon echoed with 2-part singing German folk tunes, overlapping the hum of country standards, crackling on a little radio. The blend was awkward and lovely, like mismatched voices learning harmony through repetition. Hilda, the youngest, liked to sketch. In the evenings, she began drawing portraits of their visitors, charcoal smudges on scraps of paper. She captured details: a freckle, a hair ribbon, the proud tilt of a chin. The Texan women would return a day later with gifts: biscuits, sewing thread, wildflowers pressed between hymn book pages. But not everyone approved. There were whispers in town. Those German women with their fancy ways. One letter to the local paper asked why prisoners deserved beauty privileges. It stung, yet even the critics returned to camp needing repairs to a slipped braid or an accidental home haircut. Pragmatism can soften conviction. As weeks moved into months, the salon became both refuge and confessional. The air trembled with the heat of summer and the scent of salvaged soap. But inside those thin walls, gentleness took root. Painful talk crept in dutiful sons overseas, brothers missing, the city of Hamburg after the bombings. Lotta never spoke of her fiancé, believed lost at Stalingrad, yet sometimes her hands would tremble when she trimmed a lock that reminded her of his hair. Eventually, she told Mrs. Henderson, her most regular client, that cutting hair felt like prayer, something small yet sacred that demanded full attention. Mrs. Henderson nodded and replied that on hard days she prayed while brushing her own daughter's curls. The two laughed softly at the parallel. Different faiths, same motion. Gradually, guards noticed changes beyond the barrack. Interactions at the fences grew civil. Small kindnesses followed: a guard slipping extra soap to the women's work detail, a prisoner mending a torn glove without being asked. The salon's rhythm had leaked into camp life, teaching restraint through routine. By late autumn, the Texas mornings turned cool. A new energy filled the air. The war felt nearer to its end. The women saved strands of cut hair in a box, braided into tiny ropes as practice for wig making, a post-war dream. Every Saturday, when Lotta opened the door to let in the first swirl of dust and daylight, she allowed herself one private, wicked fantasy that perhaps the world would remember them not as prisoners, but as artisans, as caretakers, as something smaller yet infinitely humbler. Women who kept beauty alive while the nations went mad. And beneath the steady snick of her well-worn shears, the sense grew unspoken but undeniable that kindness, in any language, can be learned by hand. Winter arrived late to central Texas, creeping in on a wind that smelled of cedar smoke and dust. The camp changed with the season guard towers ringed with tinsel scraps, ranch wives wearing handmade scarves instead of wide brim hats. Inside the little salon, paper snowflakes twisted in the draft from the open door. For months, the place had hummed like a hive, steady and safe from the madness outside. Then, one December afternoon, the calm fractured. Lotta's shears had broken mid-trim, the hinge finally giving out from endless sharpening. She froze, blade caught in a customer's hair. "It's all right," said Mrs. Henderson, her voice gentle. "We'll fix it." And fix it they did. Mrs. Henderson returned 2 days later with her husband's pliers and a small bolt scrounged from the machine shed. Together, guard and prisoner bent over the injured scissors like mechanics repairing a heart. When the crack of metal realigned, a cheer went up low. Sheepish, but real. Those repaired shears became a talisman, their joint now marked by a tiny ridge of solder, proof that strangers could save each other's tools, even when the world seemed bent on breaking everything. That ordinary act bled outward. Soon, the local women began speaking more openly about their own worries. Sons in France, brothers in the Pacific. The German stylists listened, unsure how to comfort, yet their silent listening itself became a kind of balm. On the flip side of sympathy sat shame. They also read the news about bombings in the cities they once called home. In that sadness, Both sides recognized themselves helpless to protect those far away. Then came the dust storm. One afternoon, the horizon darkened, as if night were swallowing the land at noon. The guards herded everyone, the stylists, the visitors, the mess hall cooks into the main barrack until the air cleared. Sand hissed through the cracks, an uncooperative instrument playing along the walls. In that brown twilight, someone began to hum a lullaby, soft as breath. Schlaf, Kindlen, Schlaf. Another woman answered with a verse from an American gospel hymn. Their voices met like two threads sewing a single seam. When the wind finally eased, the group stepped out into a stunned stillness. The camp wore a layer of gold dust, fences draped like ghostly lace. Lotta brushed grit from her hair and laughed a free, reckless sound that startled everyone. The others joined her without knowing why. It felt, for a blink, like peace. From that day onward, small formalities evaporated. The sign outside the salon was quietly repainted. Ladies and Friends Salon. No mention of nationality, no mention of camp. Women came and went, guards looked the other way, and what had begun as a gesture of practicality turned into an unspoken truce. Lotta noticed the difference in eyes rather than words. The wary stare that once met her hands had turned into open trust. In the mirror's reflection, she saw not captor and captive, but two women measuring care in inches of hair. She realized that every strand falling to the floor was an old fear, clipped free and forgotten. By the turn of the year, news whispered through camp the Allies advancing, Europe shifting. Freedom was close, yet she found herself dreading its arrival. How strange, she thought, that she might miss this place, these people, this fragile world drawn on borrowed time. It was then she understood the truth the mirror had been showing all along. War divides, but work. Steady, ordinary work. Done with care braids humanity back together. The transformed faces before her, each one less guarded than the week before, proved it. Outside, winter sparrows darted between fence posts. Inside, Lotta's scissors, newly mended, clicked in rhythm, soft, persistent, defying the silence that followed every distant headline. When victory finally touched Texas in the spring of 1945, it arrived not as fireworks or triumph, but as rumor carried on the April wind. Newspapers rattled through town. The camp loudspeaker barked official words about Europe, about surrender, about homecoming. Inside the little salon, the day felt hollow. The German stylists cleaned their mirrors, folded towels, coiled cords the same motions as always, only slower, deliberate, aware that they were performing a goodbye. Within weeks, trucks arrived. Names were read. Prisoners filed out beneath the same sun that had bleached their first days here. Some wept. Others stared into the distance as if memorizing the line of mesquite trees, the faded horizon they had come to trust. Lotta placed her scissors in Mrs. Henderson's palms, a small, comical pair patched with a drop of solder at the hinge. "For remember," she whispered, her accent still rounding the consonants. "Friend cuts fear, ja?" Then she turned and joined the column moving toward the trucks. She did not look back, but Mrs. Henderson kept waving long after the dust had swallowed them all. Years later, a letter arrived, postmarked Bremen. The handwriting was careful, practiced in a foreign language. Lotta had reopened a salon, one mirror, two chairs, the same ritual of soap and talk. Business was modest, she wrote, but every customer leaves lighter than she arrived. There was a photograph, her hands mid-motion, scissors gleaming just as they had under the Texas sun. Stories like theirs multiplied quietly across continents. Former prisoners who had painted, baked, gardened, or mended clothes during internment, wrote home about the Americans who had treated them as people first, enemies second. The fences vanished, but the gentleness lingered. Many Texans, decades later, still told visitors about the German girls who cut our hair when everything else was rationed. In the empty ground where Camp Hearn once stood, you can still find scraps, bent nails, broken glass, the stone outline of a foundation. Some say that when the wind catches right at dusk, you can hear faint humming from that direction, a tune without words, part lullaby, part gospel. Perhaps it's only the wind, combing through the grass. What mattered most was never recorded in reports or discharge papers, the mischievous jokes traded across accents, the quiet laughter that outlasted rumor. Those moments became invisible architecture, holding memory where no building remains. The war's grand epilogues belonged to presidents and generals. But the softer truth, the one that shaped hearts rather than borders, was built in places like that, shed with the crooked mirrors. Within its thin walls, women discovered that even in captivity, compassion can be practiced until it feels like muscle memory. And when they finally walked into the light beyond the wire, they carried that memory home like contraband of the soul. Because in the end, victory is not the banner raised after battle. Sometimes victory is the simple sound of scissors closing, one final time, in perfect human rhythm.